First of all, I'd like to introduce Dr. Grace Hodder. She's a floodplain ecologist for the Chowilla Icon site, where she, and fortunately for her, has been monitoring the ecological response to environmental watering since 2021. An ecologist who arrived at a time when water and flow were only going to get better. For all of your counterparts who arrived here in the early 2000s, there was no joy for a decade. In fact, some never even saw the river rise. So Grace was originally a terrestrial ecologist. She's now a full floodplain convert with a newfound appreciation for mud and all the cool critters that live in it. But her true obsession is birds, and the diverse communities of terrestrial and wetland birds at Chowilla have proven fascinating to study. Please make welcome Grace Hodder.
Thanks, Tony. So this is a collaboration between myself and Helga, who's in the audience, and I'm not going to stop embarrassing you tonight, Helga. And then Perry Stenhouse and Ashwin Rudder. They both worked on the analysis over the years on these long-term data sets. Which was no easy task because Helga has almost single-handedly collected 12 years of data on our terrestrial birds in every season, which is a phenomenal task, really. And she's also contributed to the wetland birds data set, and she's also taken all the amazing photos in this entire presentation. So this is all about Helga. Okay, this is Helga measuring the size of her data set. She's going to. So like a river red gum, these long-term data sets are an incredibly valuable asset that we have at our disposal. And they're hard-won, they're hard to come by. They really take consistent monitoring effort from the community, staff, contractors, volunteers, and also consistent funding. And in this case, that's made possible by the TLM, which is pretty phenomenal. We have 12 years of terrestrial bird data. We have fewer years of wetland bird data. I'm going to begin with the terrestrial birds and then we'll get to the wetland birds. So Chowilla, you've seen this before, but it's the most northerly of all the icon sites. It sits in a semi-arid zone, but it abuts the arid zone. And that means that we get these really magnificent rangeland, inland, arid Australian bird species visiting our floodplain pretty regularly. And when you combine this with our resident floodplain bird assemblages, we have a whole suite of species that reside predominantly in the black box, a whole suite that use the red gum, a list of birds that use both, and then birds that use the adjacent mallee and then visit the floodplain intermittently. So this amounts to 116 woodland bird species using Chowilla over the last decade or so. But there's a seasonal pattern of movement towards the floodplain in spring and summer and away again in autumn and winter. And so here we need multiple years of data to be able to assess longer term trends and account for these seasonal movements. The green and yellow species on the right, they move towards the floodplain in spring and summer. We only ever pick them up in spring and summer. The number of years that Helga has picked these up is in the brackets. Not very many come for winter, some of them, but they're very wise. So this is reflected in our abundance modelling of individual species. So the grey butcherbird is just one example, but several species reflect these trends. So in winter, grey butcherbirds have significantly lower abundances in our floodplain compared with all the other seasons. There's potentially movement here as well, potentially, other effects. But you might notice this other pattern that goes over multiple years. And these, of course, follow the flood years, the flood cycles or the really wet years. So what we think we're seeing here is a broader pulse of movement towards the floodplain by avifauna from adjacent dryland areas. Avifauna is birds, sorry. And this potentially extends something like the flood pulse concept or the river heartbeat, which explains lateral movement out onto the floodplain during a flood. And that really drives primary productivity and secondary productivity to a greater extent than you would see by rainfall alone in adjacent areas. And I think attracts avifauna and, of course, coupled with local booms in population from breeding potentially. But this is not explored greatly in the literature. and we were lucky enough to delve into this data set with some fancy modelling, and we found a really neat relationship between flow in the river and terrestrial bird abundance on the floodplain, which is pretty cool. It's intuitive, but it hasn't necessarily been shown all that frequently. And of course, we can then manipulate that flow to enhance that for birds as well with using our environmental regulator. Okay, on the right, you'll have to bear with me a little bit. This is a model that includes the different types of inundation. So the parameters in the model are listed there. They're mean flow, high flow, natural flood. And then the bottom three in green are our environmental watering options. So we have pool connected wetlands, we have pumping to wetlands, and we have operating the regulator. The middle line, the dotted line, that's having a neutral effect on bird abundances. That's the average flow over that whole time period. So anything to the right has a positive effect on bird abundances. So you can see that a high flow year has a really significant positive effect. Natural flood, a big effect with lots of variation. The blue and the orange are the best fit models and the second best fit models. We can use them both to build up a picture. So pool connected wetlands, when they are inundated, have a significantly positive effect. And then, of course, we don't always have the benefit of having a natural flow and or a high flow. Well, everyone tells me that. But we can use pumping and operating the regulator to increase bird abundance, even though it's not as significant an effect in this model. Does that mean that our birds are going really well on the floodplain? Not necessarily. The weebill stands out in our individual species assessments. The weebill is Australia's smallest bird, but one of the most numerous birds. So it's recorded quite regularly in the surveys. And that means that we could fit a model to this data, which told us definitively that there is a declining trend here over this time period. And that's concerning because it is one of the more common birds. And if the weebill is showing these declining trends, I think it's highly likely that there are other species with the same habitat requirements that are also showing declining trends, but we can't fit a model to those data because the data is too sparse. So we just can't show it. But I think we need to use the weebill as a bit of a warning sign here. On the flip side, bluebonnets are increasing on Chowilla. Helga keeps telling us this, and now the data shows a really neat trend there. There's not even a seasonal interaction effect. So what's going on? Well, Todd didn't talk so much about black box health in his presentation, and it is site specific, and Todd, tell me if I'm wrong here, but there are certain areas in the outer floodplain that we can't reach with environmental water necessarily, and other areas throughout the floodplain where we have ongoing losses of black box trees. And both of these species are significantly associated with black box woodlands rather than red gum. Weebills forage in the canopy, so they need a productive, healthy canopy. They eat insects and lerps from the canopy, whereas bluebonnets eat seeds, so they forage on the ground predominantly, and they're potentially more able to move around the landscape and follow their resources. They're not as attached to having alive trees in the landscape. In fact, they like it quite open. And this is just a theory, it needs testing, but potentially something that's showing a shift in the community in the wrong direction. Okay, we have some declining species, some increasing species. Where does that leave us overall? These are all of the terrestrial bird species abundances modelled together over season and years. So what we're not seeing here is an overall decline, and you can see some really strong increases over the last 2 wet years. This might just be bluebonnets, but I don't think so. They're probably contributing, but I don't think that's the main picture we're seeing. I think what we're seeing is potentially a history of environmental water coupled with high flows and natural floods offsetting some broader declines. So most of the species, not most of them, but a lot of the species we have on our floodplain are known to be declining throughout their Australian range. And there is a study that shows that floodplains can act as a buffer against this. And so potentially we would be seeing an overall declining trajectory here if we weren't able to put water on the floodplain to act as a refuge through this period of time. So to find out what's going to happen next and whether these large abundances translate into a sustained increase or maybe just more bluebonnets, we need to keep collecting long-term data, which is very important. Okay, wetland birds. So these species rely on water for all aspects of their life history. We have 4 years, not as impressive as Helga's data set, but these are 4 years of robust and consistent methods, monitoring methods that can be modelled and looked at over some pretty interesting conditions. And these are the outer ephemeral lakes of Chowilla. These are the lakes that support the huge diverse assemblages of wetland birds. They're the ones we monitor. So the circles here relate to the abundance of the birds seen on any given morning, the maximum abundance. So you can see that Coombul is the clear winner with nearly 10,000 birds just from a couple of hours of counting, a couple of painful hours of counting. And then the other larger lakes consistently support several thousand birds on any given morning when they're inundated, which I think is pretty mind-blowing. Even the smaller lakes, several hundred. And there is association between the size of the lake and the amount of birds they support. 150 hectares seems to be a sweet spot. But we can deliver environmental water to any one of those larger lakes in isolation, which is, I think, a pretty powerful management tool that we have up our sleeve. So here are some beautiful photos, of course, all by Helga, taken at our ephemeral lakes to demonstrate that it's not just the size of the lake that it's important, but it's the ephemeral nature. So when they're wet after a dry, the nutrients are mobilised from the mud, and they set off a whole chain of ecological processes that drives a boom in macrophytes and macroinvertebrates and frogs and fish and all sorts of things that wetland birds like to eat. And as they dry down, the mudflats are exposed, along with a whole new resource in the form of mud-dwelling crustaceans and invertebrates. They also support a high diversity. It's not all about abundance. The diversity is more even across these lakes. The circle here relates to diversity, just to confuse you this time. So the take home here is that across the whole Murray-Darling Basin, there are only about 80 wetland bird species described. Just one of our lakes supports well over half of those species when they're inundated, and this is cumulative over the last 4 years, but I still think that's pretty phenomenal. And combined, we've supported 70 of those 80 species over the last 4 years. So now I'm going to flip the script a little bit and I'll show you why we don't need just one lake, we need multiple lakes watered in succession. These are abundances of birds. They're moving, this is roughly the same bird assemblage moving from lake to lake as they're watered and dried across 12 months of environmental water delivery. This was in 2021. We began by pumping to isolated lakes and then we backed it up by operating the regulator. And you might notice a preference for moving towards the lakes as they're freshly inundated to exploit that wave of productivity that happens upon inundation, and then moving back towards the lakes as they're dried down and the mudflats are exposed. So by watering multiple lakes in succession, we've kept this same assemblage of several thousand birds, many, many species, in the landscape for a full 12 months. They haven't had to leave and they've just been able to sit at a lake until a new lake is available to exploit. So how does this compare to the flood year and the high flow year that we've just had? I modelled the abundances that we supported across these 4 years. So the error bars are the 95% confidence interval of these parameter estimates. When they're overlapping with one another, they're generally considered not to be significant. So what I want you to take home from this is that we support relatively similar abundances than we did during the high flow and the flood year, during a year when we operated the regulator and a year when we pumped to isolated sites. And even just the fact that we're in the same ballpark as those major years, I think is pretty impressive. There's a significantly lower effect here from the operation, and I think compared with the pumping. And I think that's because during the pumping year, we had those resources concentrated in just 2 or 3 lakes. But during the operation, we provided a whole range of options for wetland birds. So areas of floodplain, smaller areas were used by those birds that I wasn't necessarily monitoring. Okay. Okay, so that's not the whole picture. Environmental water isn't necessarily doing it all. When we look at species richness, the high flow in the flood years attracted significantly higher species richness compared with our environmental water delivery years. We just can't always compete with that landscape scale signal and all the birds moving around during the flood necessarily. This one's for you, Fiona, the little GIF. So breeding is a really important component to supporting these communities. The rule of thumb is that we need about 120 days of inundation for a wetland bird species to build its nest and lay its eggs and raise its young. And of course, we need emergent vegetation from which to do that. So I looked at the duration of inundation over the last 10 years at Chowilla. So the green dotted line right down the bottom is that 120-day sweet spot. So we're blowing it out of the park, blowing it out of the water. Maybe that's a better saying. With our own version of Mother Nature, Robbie Bonner, and of course Warren, who usually does the actual work. Yeah. But yeah, so we haven't actually recorded colonial nesting or large nesting events at Chowilla by waterbirds in the last 10 years, despite our lakes looking this enticing. And these are the almost exact places on Chowilla where we used to record big groups of nesting waterbirds. So what's going on? Well, I looked at the inundation of the lignum basin components of these large ephemeral lakes. Those are usually the areas on the outside that dry down first, and they're harder to keep water at for longer periods. So now hopefully you can see the green line. Now suddenly it takes a very angry Mother Nature, or maybe an angrier Robbie Bonner, working ahead of a flood or a high flow to deliver those durations. Lignum is not the only factor here. We might be looking at losses of key stands of trees or depth and a whole range of other interactions, but this is just sort of one idea that I explored. But Chowilla is just one piece of the puzzle, so we're just one of a whole string of icon sites. We're part of a huge food bowl. That's the Murray-Darling Basin that goes right across the continent. Heather McGuinness's work shows really beautifully how this is just one straw-necked ibis named Elf. And Elf travels the width and the breadth of the Murray-Darling Basin to find the resources that it needs. And then this is a photo taken by Helga of a straw-necked ibis using Chowilla, taking some of the resources from Chowilla on its journey across the whole basin. And if we zoom out even further, we're part of these two migration pathways used by migratory waders. So they come from the Arctic Circle all the way to Chowilla, and then of course the Coorong, the other icon site here. And they weigh between 10 or 15 grams. Sometimes they travel over 13,000 kilometres. So when they get here, they're pretty hungry. And by pumping water or delivering water with our regulator to those large ephemeral lakes and creating that huge boom in productivity, we're filling up their bellies before they go back again. And we're contributing to a global food bowl, which I think is a pretty phenomenal outcome for our environmental water. That's it.